Do I look happy today? Here's why. This is the new JB Perfect Freestyle build. This is what happens when I pick the exact parts that I want from my freestyle build. Some of them I even have helped develop. And I put them all together, and this is exactly the perfect freestyle quad that I want to be flying. I'm Joshua Bardwell. Let's build this quad. You're going to learn something today. Like to do at the beginning of every build is take you through all the parts that I'm going to be using in the build and tell you just a little bit of the story of why I've selected those parts. And a lot of times there's something else that's driving me to choose a particular part. But in this case, all of these parts I have settled on. In many cases, I've had a hand in designing them. So I really want you guys to understand kind of where my mind's at in picking these parts. And the frame is the Luminaire QAV-S Joshua Bardwell edition. Now, I've got a built one here. I previously reviewed the QAV-S in my lightweight freestyle frame roundup, and in that video I said that I am looking for a lighter weight build, closer to 700 grams all up than 750 or even 800 grams that some of my builds have been. I'm convinced that lighter quads fly better, and that, at least for that's how I feel. Many people disagree with that and are happy flying 800 gram freestyle builds, and they're great pilots, but I want something a little bit lighter. So I looked for a frame in the approximately 115 gram range, and the QAV-S fits that bill. I really like the design of the QAV-S. I think it's very intelligently designed. I think it's durable without giving up too much in terms of either aesthetics or function. And I especially like the clever way that the arms come together. I'll show you more when we assemble the frame and talk about that. It's very durable, easy to change, stiff, with good resonance characteristics, and innovative. I just really dig it. For motors, I'm going to be going with the FPVCycle 5-inch motor. And we've got right here the 5-inch Emeralds. They've also got the 5-inch, what he's calling the Imperials, which are the white bell design. Both of these motors are interchangeable. The Emeralds are a little bit less expensive in cosmetic ways, but they're supposed to perform exactly the same. I chose these motors, to be honest with you, I really didn't know what motor I was going to put on this, because I think a lot of motors fly pretty much the same. And you basically get a motor that's reasonably well designed, reasonably durable, and not too expensive, and you just get on with your freaking life. But I flew these motors And I think there's really something special to them. I'll put a link to my full review of these motors down in the video description below. I think they have really good low throttle control without giving up. Like usually when a motor has good low throttle control, it's just not that powerful. So it feels like it has great resolution, but then it has no top end. These motors really seem to do it all. I think they're just really exceptional motors. And that's what I'm going to be going with. A lot of people are going to be surprised to hear that I'm not going with my own JB 2208 or 2407 Luminaire motors. And in case you didn't know, these motors are not being made anymore. There are several reasons why they're not being made anymore. There were some manufacturing complexities that meant we couldn't get them exactly how I wanted them. I got to tell you, one of the biggest reasons they're not being made anymore is I looked around at other fantastic motors that were out there, and I thought, I'd rather be flying those motors. Those are amazing motors. When I first made these motors, basically nobody was making a 2407, and I wanted to be able to develop my own motor. And so that was the trade-off I made for getting Luminaire to make me the motor. These days, there are a lot of great motors in a lot of different sizes, and I just don't feel like there's a compelling reason for me to just be making this motor just to have a motor in the same colors that I like. Especially because these motors are so freaking good, and I'd rather be flying them. Flight controller is going to be the JB F7. Obviously, I've got a release video for this flight controller where I talk about all the thoughts that went into designing it, and I'll put a link to that down in the video description. It's my flight controller. I love it. I think it's really, really good, and I'm going to be using it. The ESC is an iFlight ESC that goes with the JB F7. It's an ESC. It's not remarkable. It's good enough. It'll get the job done. ESCs aren't that big a deal. And the video transmitter. Oh, by the way, did I mention we're going to be doing both an analog and a DJI build. So yes, I will be, and I'll probably be flying it with DJI in it because, you know, DJI is pretty freaking awesome. But I will also be doing analog build for those who still fly analog. And for you, the video transmitter that we're going to be using is the Rush Tank Solo. This thing outputs like 1.6 watts, 1600 milliwatts. The actual number is debated. Everyone agrees it's north of 1 watt. It's freaking big. Well, I mean, not compared to some video transmitters, but compared to like a Unify, it's big. But I can't, for freestyle, you just want as much penetration as you can get. And I think this is a great video transmitter to choose for that. And then for the analog camera, we are going to be using the JB Runcam Phoenix. This one has apparently been used before. Oh well, not a big deal. I've got a release video about the JB Runcam Phoenix, talking about the way that I tweak the image to be how I like it. In addition, another nice feature of the JB Phoenix is that it has digital camera control. You can hook it up to a UART on your flight controller and then adjust the settings if you want to. And we'll be doing that in this build. That's something that the standard Phoenix doesn't have. Now we come to an uncomfortable part of the video where I have to acknowledge that some of these parts are not going to be possible for you to purchase, either because they are out of stock for an extended period of time, or because you live outside the United States and they ship from inside the United States and the shipping is going to be prohibitive. So I'm going to give you a couple alternative suggestions, and if you want to wait, then by all means do. But I know many people are going to want to get in on this build today, and I want to give you some options, especially in this day and age where stuff is just so often out of stock and hard to get. As far as the frames go, if you're looking for a different frame, any of the frames in my lightweight freestyle frame roundup could be used in this build. They were all really freaking good. The Halo RC Osiris, I think, deserves special attention. It is a very, very well designed lightweight frame without giving up much durability, and it ships from the UK, which is not technically a part of the EU anymore, but is in Europe, and shipping is probably cheaper. Go check out that video and just pick whichever one of those frames you like the best. They're all pretty decent frames. As far as motors go, it is currently June, the beginning of June 2021. The FPVCycle 5-inch motors are not expected to be back in stock at FPVCycle for like 2 months. And I was so tempted to just pick a different motor, but this video is going to be up for a year at least, and those are really damn good motors, and I'm sticking with them. But if you don't want to wait, the next motor that I was gonna pick was going to be the T-Motor F40 Pro price no object. It's like a $27 motor. It is an excellent motor. What makes it stand out compared to other 2306 sized motors is its lightweight, which is in tune with this build. It's a couple grams lighter than many of the alternatives. If you don't want to spend $27 on a motor, the iFlight Zing 2 2306 or 2207, great choice. If you're a little bit more on a budget, the Emax Eco is a solid choice, although this is a premium build. Don't be tempted to go for the iFlight Zing 2 2506, because that motor, it's similar to Bob's motor in size, but the KV and the weight are totally different. It does not perform the same, and it's not a substitute. Well, all right, let's start putting this quadcopter together. And I want to let you know that there are chapter markers down in the timeline. If you look at the bottom of the timeline, there's little chapter markers there, and you can actually click on the title of the current chapter. And over on the right side of the screen, there'll be a list of the chapters. I'm going to mark some of these chapters as DJI and some of these chapters as analog, because those chapters will only apply if you're building the DJI or the analog version. And then the rest of the chapters will just be the same regardless of which one you're doing. The first thing I want you to do is just take this plate here and set it down, and then take the arms, and I just want you to visualize how they go together. The arms are going to go together like this up against this center X plate, and then there are going to be these two little arrowhead pieces that wedge in and hold them in place. That's how it's going to go together. I want you to keep that picture in your head. I'm going to take this plate, which is the bottom front plate, and I'm going to get this bag of M3x16 screws. There are going to be 4 of those screws. I'm going to put those screws up through these holes on the front bottom plate. Okay, screws are in. I'm going to take the arms, and I'm going to install the arms. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Then I'm going to take the X plate, and I'm going to insert the X plate, and I can kind of start to push this together a little bit. You can see it, start to see how it's going to go together. Then I'm going to take the rear bottom plate, and with the press nuts facing up, I'm just going to slide it down over the top of those screws. You may need to wiggle things to get it to all go together. Then I'm going to take this bag of 6 small standoffs, and by the way, there's another bag with 2 large standoffs. We'll be using those later, but we're going to be using the 6 short standoffs for now. And we're just going to thread those loosely onto the screws. No need to tighten it down yet. We'll just do it finger tight. Now you're going to see that the arms are nearly completely installed, but they can still kind of wiggle here, and that's what these little arrowhead pieces are going to be for. We're going to get these 2 M3x12 screws, and what we're going to do is slide the arrowhead in, wedging in the side, and then from the bottom that M3x12 is going to go up and in. And that is going to engage with this press nut here, and once that's wedged in, the arms should be good and secure. Now I'm having a little bit of trouble getting this screw to line up with this press nut. You may need to kind of spread the far side arms a little bit to wedge that in, and then try and kind of squeeze the near side arms to get that arrowhead to fully seat in, so that the screw lines up with the press nut. It's got to be tight because you don't want any wiggle in the arms. Before we go any further, I've noticed a mistake I've made in the assembly of the frame. I want to point it out to you so you don't make the same mistake. Do you see that my X plate here is not up against my bottom plate? It's pressed against here, and we've got this space right here. We don't want that. This X plate, we want it pressed up against the rear plate. So what I'm gonna do, I think the thing to do is to loosen the little arrowhead pieces. Can we just loosen everything? I don't don't think it's going to come loose unless I take the arrowhead pieces out. Maybe I can just take one of them out. I'm going to take this arrowhead piece out. I'm going to loosen up the arms. There. And did you see it fell down? That's where we want it, is pressed up against this plate here. The next thing we're going to do is install the motors. I like to build my quadcopters from the outside in. In order to do that, we're going to grab this bag of M3x8 cap head screws. These are included by Luminaire to mount your motors. I made a big deal a while back about arguing that frame manufacturers should include motor screws, because frame manufacturers know how thick the arms are going to be, and therefore they should know how long the motor screws need to be. And we're, walking that talk. Now that the motors are installed, the next thing to do is install the stack screws. And the kit that I've got, which is the kit that originally came in the FPV crate, has got 4 M3 by 25 millimeter screws. There's a problem with that. These do not take into account the fact that this is a slam deck design and the standoffs are shorter. These will not work unless you were to maybe put like a nut on there and make it act like a shim to make the screws effectively be shorter, or you could always just grind them down or cut them down. So the ideal length is 22 millimeters, and I hope that by the time you are seeing this, unless you were one of the people who bought the very first batch in FPV crate, that they will come with 22 millimeter screws. That is the intent. I'm going to take some of these 22 millimeter cap head screws that I just happen to have, because that's the kind of guy I am, and just make sure they're 22 millimeters before I frickin' screw them all the way in, because yikes. Because we're working with 30 millimeter hardware, we're going to take these outer screw holes. If we were working with 20 millimeter hardware, we take the inner screw holes, and we're just going to drive those on through. Times like this, it would be very, very nice to have an electric driver. This isn't too bad. Alrighty, so we've got those 4 screws in, and on the top side, we've got the 4 stack screws poking up. Here's the iFlight ESC that I'm using, and here's what comes in the box. We've got the ESC, we've got an XT60, we've got a capacitor, we've got some wires, and some MISC hardware. At first glance, it looks like the ESC comes with gummies, but in fact they are just rubber washers. So what we're going to do is put 1 washer on each of the 4 mounting screws. And then install the ESC with the XT60 facing out the back. And then we'll install 1, 2, 3, 4 of those little washers on top. Next, I'm going to cut the XT60 to length, and I think I'm going to have it come out the side, because coming out the back here is going to be a little bit crowded, especially when we put the Vista in there. But even if you're doing analog, I prefer to have it coming out the side. So I'm just going to kind of eyeball this where we want to cut this so they line up with their pads. Then we're going to strip and tin and solder down this XT60 lead. The more I think about this, the more I think that it's going to make the most sense to turn the ESC around and mount it facing the opposite way around, because I don't think we're going to have room for the capacitor. Maybe on the analog build, the capacitor could kind of lay on top here of the VTX, but certainly not with the Vista. Whereas I think we will have room for the capacitor here. And in fact, yeah, it can just kind of set up behind the camera maybe or something. Hey there folks, it's Joshua from the future. I got to talk to you about this power lead. I'm convinced that the way that you saw me do the power lead running through here is rubbing on the flight controller, and I've got some black box data that has some weird noise in it, and I think that's the cause. And so this is my perfect freestyle build. I'm going to do it exactly how I want to do it. And what I really wanted to do was use 14 gauge wire instead of 12 gauge wire. I've done some testing. I've made videos about it a while back, and I'm convinced that at the lengths of wire we're talking about, the amount of voltage, the resistance of a 14 gauge versus a 12 gauge wire is completely negligible, especially if you just shorten the wire up by a few centimeters. You'll more than make up the difference. So what I've done is I've gone down to 14 gauge wire, and I've just shortened the wire up a little bit, and we should get equal performance. And what that's let me do is that has let me route the wire in between the camera cage and the standoff. Hang on, get out of there. There we go. Yeah. So that's how I'm going to do it. When it was 12 gauge, I was concerned that having it rubbing on the carbon there could cut into it and fray it, and that would be really, really bad. When it's 14 gauge, I feel like there's enough room that that's not going to be an issue, although I will keep an eye out for it. I am also going to zip tie it to this standoff so that it is restrained and it is less likely to sort of move up and down and get frayed. But that is going to keep that completely off of the flight controller and not induce any noise on the flight controller. Why don't we just flip it around and put it out the backside? Well, if you've gone with the analog VTX, you really could do that. In fact, you should consider just doing that if you're building the analog version. Just do the ESC with the power lead coming out the back, the capacitor coming out the back, solder up everything, and you'll have plenty of room for that. But because I'm about to put the Caddx Vista in here, there just isn't enough room to have the power lead and the capacitor coming out the back, and the capacitor is really not optional on a 6S build. So this is how I'm going to do it. And then once it's together, I'm going to fly it a little bit, just like I did the previous build. And if there's anything I don't like about it, I'm going to reshoot this again. On with the show. I usually like to, instead of having my capacitors just hanging off like this, which a lot of people will do, I like them to be secured in some way, because if they're just hanging off like this, with vibration over time, eventually they can break off, and then you could short circuit something or damage something. So I would typically install it like up against this standoff like so. I just want to see how that's going to work with the camera plates. I think it's going to work okay. Yeah, see, the standoffs are too short for this specific capacitor. It's just the same length, and so these leads would touch the top plate, and that would be bad. But if we tuck it down in here, I think we've got enough room to have some clearance from the top plate and secure it in that little, yeah, I think that's what we're going to do. In addition to the capacitor, I'm also going to install this little guy. This is a FETTEC spike absorber, and it contains a component called a TVS diode. Capacitors are really good at smoothing out peaks and troughs in voltage and sort of rounding off the top of voltage spikes, but TVS diodes can respond much, much quicker to chop the top of a voltage spike off, and it's a really great way to help protect a build, especially if you're using 6S against voltage spikes that might, mostly that'll fry the ESC, but it can also help clean up video potentially. It's just always a good little piece of insurance to have in addition to a capacitor, if you have room for one. It also makes mounting the capacitor easier because it's got these holes right here. And what I like to do is, so we're going to identify the negative leg of the capacitor, which is marked by this gray or white band and this minus symbol here. And then we're going to identify the negative pad of the spike absorber, and we're just going to pass those through there. And I'm just going to cut a little strip of Scotch Extreme mounting tape. I always like to use mounting tape even when maybe you don't, like I'm just going to tape this whole thing up, so do we really need mounting tape? I just like to use it as a little bit of shock absorption in addition to help keep things like nice and neatly together. Here, good. And through, and let's just figure it out exactly. Yeah, perfect. And then I'm going to take some of these cut-off motor wires, and this is what I'm going to use. Anytime you put a capacitor on a length of wire, you make it a little bit less effective. So using these, what are they, 20 gauge? Yeah, using these 20 gauge motor wires is going to help mitigate that. The thicker the wire, the more effective the capacitor is going to be. And you know, we've got these spare motor wires, so there's you know, not even costing us anything. We're going to want to make sure we cover these bare wires up, these bare leads up. So I'm just going to take a piece of electrical tape and put it over there. And another piece of electrical tape. Or you can use heat shrink if you think electrical tape looks shitty. I've conveniently left these pads uncovered so I can remember which is the minus and which is the plus. Since I used black wire for both of them, I wouldn't want to get that wrong. But I should really cover those up too. Huh? I mean, yeah. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to route my motor wires, and I'm going to go ahead and tape them down to the arms, so that then when I cut them to length, they won't like accidentally be too short or the wrong length. I'm going to run them along the inside edge of the arm. The reason I like to do that is because then if you have a bent prop that strikes the arm, the prop doesn't, if you run it on top of the arm, the prop can maybe cut the motor wire. So this is minimizing the likelihood that it'll do that. I prefer to run props in on my larger builds. If you prefer to run props out, then you would run them along the front of the arm. Basically, run them along the surface of the arm that the prop is going to strike, that is not going to strike if the prop is bent. And yes, I will be using my red electrical tape to hold the wires down, which I know everyone hates. At this point, it's just a thing. It's just a thing. You can put those wires any way you like. Why doesn't he use nice fabric tape? It was such a shame on such a nice build to make it look so crappy. Whatever. At Rampage, someone gave me a roll of red electrical tape, and he had written on around the roll, F the haters. That's right, F the haters. Then I'm going to take these motor wires, 1, 2, 3. I'm going to give myself just a little slack, and I'm going to cut them to length to match the motor pads. And then I'm going to strip, tin, and solder them down. Not bad. Let's do the other 3. The other 3. All right, motors are soldered up. I think we're going to put the flight controller on here next. Where's it gone? There we go. We are going to go ahead and install these rubber gummies on the flight controller. Notice that the gummies have a longer part, and we're going to use that as a spacer. So that's going to be facing down to give a little more separation between the flight controller and the ESC. We're going to go ahead and install the ESC plug in the ESC. I always forget to do this and then wish I'd done it before I soldered up the ESC. It's always a little bit of a pain to get it installed, but there you go. And I'd like to give that a couple little twists just to take up the slack a little bit. And we'll press that down on top. Perfect. The next thing we're going to do is wire up the video transmitter and the camera. And as a reminder, if you're building this with DJI, there are chapter breaks down in the timeline, and you can skip this chapter and move to the next one. The Solo tank comes with this MMCX pigtail connector. I love the fact that it has these little screw holes. That's my favorite kind of pigtail connector. And we've designed the 3D printed parts on this quad frame to take advantage of that. It also comes with this connector here, and it's got a little locking part, which is really nice. We're just going to pop that in and make sure that cinches down. Very, very nice. The Rush tank has a 5-volt regulator on board that you can use to power your camera, but we're going to be using the voltage regulator on the flight controller, so we do not need these 5-volt out and ground wires here. You can either cut those off, or you can do what I'm going to do. I'm just going to take them out of the plug, and I'm going to do that by just lifting up this tab while pulling on the wire, and let me just pull that wire right out. And the same for this one. Now, as far as mounting goes, we've got a couple options here. The Rush Tank Solo does have M2 mounting holes on the underside. They don't go all the way through. So what you would have to do is, I guess you would want to have some M2 nylon standoffs maybe, and install them here, and then screw the screws up through them and cinch them down. I guess if you had the right length of screws, if you had the exact right length of screws, you could screw them in and just use this kind of as the nut. But I would worry about the screws loosening up because there's no like nylock or anything. So I think I'm not going to use the M2 mounting. I just don't, it seems like kind of a hassle, and I'm not sure it would be secure. I'm just going to get some of this Scotch Extreme mounting tape, cut off a little piece that's about the right size, and we're going to go that way. I think I'm going to mount this side facing down because it's flat. And let's move that as far forward as we reasonably can. That little wiggle there kind of activates the tape and locks it in. How to power this? 9-volt, running it off the 9-volt regulator would be a little cleaner, or running it off of VBAT would maybe be a little safer in case the 9-volt regulator wasn't quite up to snuff. But this is my flight controller. The 9-volt regulator is supposed to be a good strong regulator, so let's run it off 9 volts. If I didn't have full confidence in the 9-volt regulator, I might choose not to do that. And then we're going to need one UART for smart audio, and we'll just use T5 since it's right there. And there is the final result. You can check your wiring. I'm going to put some thought into making sure that the wire going across the top of the flight controller doesn't touch the gyro chips. Here, these two things are the gyro, and if anything touches them, it can cause problems with the way the quadcopter flies. I recently ran into this on a racing quad build that I did that was a lot tighter, and maybe that's the, yeah, I was like, why have I never run into this before? Maybe it's that on these builds, it's generally got enough space that the wire doesn't touch the gyro. You can see here. I'm going to put some thought into making sure it doesn't touch the gyro chips, though. We'll figure that out before the end of the build. The JB camera is wired up the same as any other camera with power, ground, and video. It's also got a TX and an RX wire that are going to go to a UART, and then there is this empty pin here, which is not used on this camera, but it's used on some other cameras. So we've also got a wire we're going to pull out of this camera plug, and it's going to be this blue wire here. Again, you can cut that off, or you can lift the tab and take it out. Camera, I usually will power from 5 volts. Most cameras are good down to 5 volts, and powering them off the lower voltage gives more filtering as for cleaner video. Video in, and we're going to use T2 and R2 for our camera control UART. And here is the result. Notice we've got TX here, which is the brown wire, going to RX here, and vice versa. Next, we're going to install the camera on the camera plates. We're going to do that using these M2x4 screws, which are included. Your camera also may have come with screws. They're fine as well, although you're going to want to check that the length is not so long as to like damage the camera. These M2x4s should grab the camera correctly and not damage the camera. And how are we going to mount this? So the camera has only a single screw hole. So I think I'm going to use this screw hole. Yeah, let's see how that works out for us. I'm just going to finger tighten that for now. Make sure we get them both the same way up. Camera's sticking out a little bit. Let's see how that actually is going to work with the front standoffs though. Actually, it works pretty badly. It does not get the standoffs out of view, and your top corners are obstructed. So I would definitely flip that camera mounting plate around and use the uppy downy vertical slit, which is closer to the front and will give you more clearance, almost as if it was designed that way. The next thing I'm going to do is install the receiver in the quad, and this is a place where your build is likely to be different from mine, just because there are so many different receiver types out there that you might be using. Crossfire, Tracer, ImmersionRC Ghost, Express LRS, or even good old FreeSky. So the exact way you wire it up, you may have to do a little research to know how to wire those up. I'm going to put some resources down in the video description of some of the setup guides and builds that I've done showing how to wire up different types of receivers. The one that I am going with is ImmersionRC Ghost. This is the receiver type that I'm kind of most excited about right now. And the short version of why that is that Ghost has the ability to do slower, higher latency, long range protocols, and faster, lower latency, shorter range protocols. It can sort of do it all. Whereas something like Crossfire versus Tracer, you kind of have to pick and choose which one you're going to put in. Here I can just, if I want to go longer, I can set it one way. If I want to do a race with ultra low latency, I can set it another way, and it just doesn't really matter. If you're having trouble picking a receiver protocol, like why didn't I go with Express LRS? Ooh, I've got a video comparing all the major receiver protocols that you could be using today, and to help you kind of make a decision for yourself if you're a little bit on the fence. Link in the video description below, of course. One of the things I like to do with all my receivers is rotate the antenna back around so that it runs over the top of the receiver. You got to make sure that the bind button and any LEDs are clear, but then when you wrap that in heat shrink or tape, it'll secure the UFL connector so it can't really pop off. If your receiver has like glued on UFL connectors, then obviously just leave that alone. And we're going to solder this up to UART 1 here in the upper left corner of the board. Most important is that we use the RX 5-volt pad for the 5-volt power to the receiver, because that is the only 5-volt pad that's powered up from USB, and it'll make it easier to bind and set up your receiver if it powers up from USB. And let's just get the length of these wires right. Regardless of if you're using Caddx Vista or the Rush Tank Solo, which is what it happens to be on here right now, the receiver, I like to mount it right on top of the video transmitter. So we'll just imagine that it's there, and we'll give ourselves a little bit of extra wire just for working purposes. We'll trim those to length and solder them up. And then I'm just going to take a little bit of this extreme mounting tape, and we'll put it on the back side, and we will let's give these wires some twists to take the slack out. Yeah, that'll do. And we'll just stick that right there. And then I never fully trust extreme mounting tape to hold. It often will, but sometimes things will come loose for various reasons. So we're going to also back it up with a zip tie going around both the VTX and the receiver. And there are these convenient little notches here to try to help keep it in place so it doesn't move. We're going to make sure we're not pressing on any of the buttons, like the bind button, or here on the VTX, the power and channel buttons. Doesn't need to be super tight. The tape will be doing most of the work, but the zip tie is just a little insurance. Now, this is the point in the build where I would bind the receiver to the controller, and if I would always update the firmware on the receiver if need be. For FreeSky, you may not need to do that, except if you can't bind. Sometimes you have to change the firmware. But for Crossfire, Tracer, Ghost, and Express LRS, you would always want to download and flash the latest firmware. I'm going to do that off camera, and again, I'll have links down in the video description to different resources you could use depending on which protocol you're using. This section of the video is for if you are going to be installing the Caddx Vista. If you're using analog VTX and camera, remember there is a table of contents down in the timeline below, and you can skip this section and go on to the next one. And the first thing I want to point out is that I always buy the Caddx Vista with the longer 12 centimeter camera cable. My theory is that you can always kind of take up a little slack in the cable, but if you buy it with too short of a cable, you're kind of screwed and there's nothing you can do about it. But I'm actually getting a little ahead of myself, because before I install the Vista in the frame, I should solder the wires to the Vista and install the antenna. And I'm only going to be using these first 4 pads, VBAT, ground, TX, and RX, because I am not using the DJI controller. The last 2 pads, the S-Bus and ground, are only used if you're using the DJI controller. For that same reason, I'm going to remove this last 2 black and yellow wires from the plug. In fact, we're not going to use the plug at all, to tell you the truth. But I'm not going to use these last 2 black and yellow wires either. And having done that, I'm going to go ahead and cut this plug off of here. We are not going to be using it. And I'd love to tell you that there was some good reason why we're not using the plug, but in truth, the reason is purely logistical. We have flipped the ESC and the flight controller around to make room for the capacitor, and the plug for the Vista is now on the wrong side of the quad, so we're just going to solder it up and make the wires go wherever we want them to go. I also like to install the Vista antenna before I put the Vista in the quad. It's easiest to do if you just take this screw out. It's difficult to do if you don't take that screw out. And you're going to want to pass that antenna through the 3D printed piece for simplicity, and then it snaps on. And then there's a little peg. You can just see it right there. There's a little peg that this goes on. And then it slides back in. And then the screw goes back in. To mount the Vista, I'm going to get out my good old double-sided tape. My 3M, my Scotch Extreme mounting tape. I don't like using just the tape. I talked about that before. We don't need to talk about it again. And because I'm going to be also using a zip tie to hold this down, I'm going to be a little bit careful about where I place it, because the zip tie is going to seat into one of these 2 notches. And I want to make sure, see this bind button right here? That's the bind button. We don't want the zip tie to run over the bind button. So you're going to make sure the bind button doesn't line up with those notches. What I'm going to try and do is just put the bind button just a little bit before this notch, and that's going to put this notch, that's going to leave the USB port and the bind button free. You're just going to want to put some thought into that when you stick it down. You know, Cricket, yeah, I'm wearing his shirt today. Cricket just sticks them down with the tape and leaves it. But I also am going to be sticking the receiver on top of here, and I just don't feel like I just like to back it up with a zip tie. What can I say? I'm going to lift the flight controller up and run the camera wire underneath it. One fewer thing to slap against the gyro. With another piece of double-sided tape, I'm going to stick the receiver down on top of the Vista. Well, that's how I like to do it. Just a little bit of insurance to help make sure that tape stays in place and make sure the receiver stays down. Always making sure that the receiver bind button is not obstructed. Nothing also holds the UFL and keeps this wire sort of out of the way. This wire is not under any actual pressure, but it's just being sort of restrained. For the antenna, Caddx provides this little clip. For mounting the Caddx Vista antenna, I suggest using this 3D print, which is available from the Thingiverse album that is linked in the video description. Basically what happens is just the Vista antenna goes down through this tube, and then you just put a couple zip ties around the tube to hold it in place. There's no fussing around with the SMA mount or screws or anything like that, like I did in this video, because I didn't have this mount. I actually asked Chris Ney to design this mount after the hassle I had to go through to get this SMA mount working with the Vista antenna. So just use this. And once the antenna is mounted, I'm just going to give it a little twist here press it down. All right, now I have to solder these up. I'm going to solder the TX and RX wires to UART2 here. Yellow is going to go to TX and white is going to go to RX. And we're going to run power to the 9-volt pad because the 9-volt regulator on the JBF7 is designed to have enough current rating to run an air unit or a Vista, and running it off the 9-volt pad instead of VBAT. The Vista technically can take VBAT, but if you run a Vista off of 6S VBAT, you can fry the TX and RX lines, and then your OSD won't work anymore. So we're going to run it off a 9-volt. And there we go. Nice. And our gyro chips are free of any obstruction. Nothing's going to be slapping them. As far as the camera goes, let's see how that's going to get mounted. First of all, locate the upward facing arrow and make sure it faces up. You can reverse that in software if you screw it up, but it's better to not have to. Now it's time to do a smoke check on this guy the very first time that we power it up. Before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and install an antenna on the video transmitter. By the way, I currently have the analog video transmitter on here because that's the order that I recorded this. If you've got the DJI, the smoke check is exactly the same, so don't let that throw you off. And just to be prudent, I'm also going to get my multimeter, put it in continuity check mode, and let's just test ground. So we'll start with the ground prong on the XT60, and we'll do some double. I can just jam it in there, and now we'll test. So for example, the USB port, the outside of the USB port should be grounded, and we'll pick any black wire here and it's grounded. Okay, great. The outside of the SMA should be grounded. So that's just testing all over to make sure that things are wired how they're supposed to be wired. Yeah, we could test the capacitor, except it's all taped up, so I'm not going to bother, but I'm sure we're fine. And then we'll also test for continuity to VBAT positive. On the JBF7, there is a great big VBAT pad here, and we do not want continuity there between that and ground. Good. And we'll do the same thing with the positive terminal on the XT60. We'll test for continuity to VBAT, and it's there. So that just gives us a little bit of confirmation that we've wired things up correctly. Next, I'm going to grab my smoke stopper here. This is the V-Fly Short Saver, actually. I've got another video about what that is and why it's good. And we're going to plug that in. And, fingers crossed, no smoke. Should let you see if there's going to be smoke. Here we go. Good. Okay. No smoke. Powered up. We are ready to go. Let's proceed. Actually, folks, that's going to do it for this video. I'm going to put the Betaflight setup in another video because this video is already plenty long enough. There will be a link down in the video description to the Betaflight setup video as soon as it releases, which will probably be the day after this video releases. So by the time you're seeing this, it's probably already there. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you if you build one of these quadcopters, I hope you freaking love it as much as I do. See you in the next one. Do you see this baby? Isn't he cute? Hit the subscribe button. Join my Patreon. Use my affiliate links. Or just keep watching videos. That's better than nothing.
Go, go, gaga, subscribe to my daddy.